Hello, it's Tuesday Q&A.
All day. Well, not the Q&A part,
Right.
just the Tuesday part.
Some people feel like the Tuesday Q&A goes all day.
Yeah.
Sometimes it does. Hey, it's Tuesday again. Yep, it's Tuesday. So we do this each Tuesday. We talk a little bit about some things that are happening, questions we get from the message, which we didn't get any questions this week. So
Must have answered them all.
well, I'm that good. Probably not. So this week, or this series, we've been going through talking about the church at Ephesus, and this week, or this right now, we're in the book of Ephesians, and this week was about the way that Christ puts us in right relationship with other people. So the first 2 weeks ago, we talked about how what Jesus did on the cross puts us in right relationship with God, and then kind of flowing out of that are the right relationships that we're in with other people. Let me ask you this. When was the first time that you realized that, when did the church body, like other Christians, when did that sort of become important to you? And we did not plan this, so we just served at the United Way Day of Caring down in Gearing, packing food boxes. So we went out to breakfast together, and then we came back here, and now we're doing this. So
Yeah.
no, not planned.
Not at all. That's okay. But that's a good question. I would say not in a really well thought out way, but in I guess more of a guttural way. When I was in junior high, we had moved here to town, and the church at Bryant had a really good youth group. And we went to that church, and I got engaged with some of the other students there, like Shane Coop, our worship pastor, a friend of mine, Scott Robinson. We used to do everything together, he and I and his brother Jacob. We lived across the street from them. We walked to school together. We hung out after school together. We were together all the time. And I was involved in youth group stuff. We used to have like Sunday night church. We'd go out after Sunday night and do stuff. I remember going to Dwight and Jenny Barrett's house when we were kids after a Sunday night service. And after we'd been here in town for maybe a year and a half, I don't know, somewhere around there, my dad started preaching at another little church in the area. And all of a sudden, we didn't go to Bryant anymore. We went somewhere else that had like 2 other kids. And I was ripped out of that. And I remember being really mad about that. And it ended up that I was able to still come to some things and still maintain friendships and stuff. But like I said, it wasn't a real well thought out theological position when I was 14 years old. But I remember I had found a body where I belonged and I fit in. And now I was taken out of that. And part of it was just, I don't get to hang out with my buddies. But there was more to it than that. There really was a sense that I had that there was some spiritual nourishment happening through the relationships that I was being deprived of. I would have made that argument that way at that point in my life. But now looking back, I know that's really what was going on. So that probably would have been the first time when I really realized that. And then in high school, we moved.
Sit back and press pause.
Yeah.
So that is not where I was expecting you to go with the conversation. So how has that shaped your student ministry world, your student ministry experience, your role in student ministry? Like how has that experience kind of shaped that?
I would say that in my student ministry, I do what probably terrifies a lot of adults, which might be why I have a hard time finding adults to help. I leave lots of unstructured time with the students because that's time when they connect with each other and they relate with each other. And I know that leaves a lot of opening for things to go poorly, but it also leaves a lot of opening for God to work, and I believe he does that, and I've seen him do that a lot in that unstructured time. And so that's been a big part of it. I want our students to connect to each other in relationships that go beyond just what we do here on Wednesday night or Sunday morning. Because there really is a lot of strength in those relationships, and they're crucial. They've been crucial to my life. I know, thinking about the most meaningful relationships that I have, they've all been birthed out of church situations. All of my most meaningful relationships started within the context of either a congregation or my time at Bible college. And I have friends all over the world that's the case with. And I think, to me, that's been a source of encouragement and strength throughout my life. And so I want to shape our program in a way that allows that to happen and fosters that. It's not going to happen on accident.
Yeah.
It's going to happen because we're pulling certain levers and putting students in certain situations where they have a chance to do that.
Yeah.
I don't want to program relationship out of the whole ministry by filling every slot of scheduling with some activity that keeps them focused on the activity. I want our activities to help them focus on each other and ultimately on Christ. But so yeah, that's really where it started. And I think because that's where it started for me, my need for the body really started to click with me during those years in the youth ministry at Bryant. And it clicked deeply enough that that's what led me to pursue youth ministry in the first place. And that was 30 years ago. So here I am.
Yeah, it's interesting that you started when you were in middle school and high school. 'Cause
I was a strange kid.
No. I mean, I think it just wasn't where I expected you to start. I was, like, when I was thinking about that question, when I was walking from my office out here into the lobby, like I was going to start when we came back to the church, because part of our experience with Christianity was growing up in the church and then leaving for a while and then coming back. So my default was that coming back into the church and just being surrounded by people who just let us ask questions.
Yeah.
People who were very much in the same place of life as we were with young kids. Like, for us, this would have been 1995, 1996. So our kids are 4 and 5 years old, and we had a lot of people around us with kids in that same space. And they were all like church people, and they were really friendly and really welcomed us in, and, like, as I said, allowed us to ask a lot of questions.
Yeah.
I think that probably built on a foundation that I had from when I was in middle school and high school, because I was very involved in our, kind of like you were describing, I was very involved in our student ministry when I was growing up. And there was, I mean, we didn't, I want to be careful how I say this. With a lot of those kids that I was a kid with in my teen years, I would say we didn't always necessarily, like, do Christian things. So, yeah, I'm just being careful with that. We didn't always do Christian things, but the reason that we were in relationship with one another was started in that church environment.
Yeah.
Um, and even though we did some pretty dumb things when we were in high school together, there was still this, I don't know, the center of gravity that I would describe as Jesus at this point in my life. Like he was the center, and he was holding us together in the midst of that, and it was really interesting. This is probably 20 years ago. One of the guys who was our youth pastor when I was in high school was in Atlanta about the same time I was. I think it was around my high school reunion, and some of my other friends, kind of from that youth group era, were all in Atlanta at about the same time. So we had this kind of, like, I didn't go to my high school reunion, which is, I'm not even going to talk about that. I didn't go to my high school reunion, but we had kind of like a youth group reunion, and it was really neat because for a lot of the kids that were in that same era of youth ministry that I was, many of them were involved and engaged in a church somewhere. And this is before I was in ministry. Like from a paid perspective, I was working in a church in a student ministry with a youth pastor as a leader volunteer in the ministry. But it was just kind of really interesting. Like, despite all of these other things, a lot of the kids from the era that I was in student ministry, like they were all plugged in and connected into a church somewhere. Yeah. So that laid a foundation for me of recognizing, I think, like when we came back to the church, I can find relationships here, and it just looks different now that I'm adult, because I'm probably not going to go out and do a bunch of unchristian stuff with these people, because I think the focus was changed. It wasn't just the thing that brought us together, but it was the thing that I think at this point as a mid to late 20s person, but Jesus became like the thing that our lives were actually centered around, rather than just bringing us together and it was kind of a part of our life. Like he became the reason that we were actually in relationship with one another.
Yeah.
And that was different. That was a different experience for me.
Yeah, and I would say for me, growing up, after those junior high years, the church has always been kind of a relational hub in my life.
Yeah.
And I think back on all those connections over the years and over the different places that I've lived. And yeah, it's the same thing. There's a gravity as we move toward Jesus where he draws us together. Obviously my understanding of that is greater now than it was in junior high. But really I can recognize God's hand in bringing me to certain places at certain times in my life where what I needed, he provided in the people that were present at that church. I think of even beginning in ministry out in a small farm town where I didn't know anybody. And I don't know a whole lot about farming and hogs and all that stuff. But it was evident right away when we interviewed that this is where God was bringing us. And we had some relationships that grew very quickly in that place where, as Luann and I had been married for several years, that was right about the time when Emily was born. We actually found out that Luann was pregnant with Emily like a couple weeks before we interviewed out there. And we were hundreds of miles away from our families, but that church really kind of adopted us as their young couple, and really became sort of surrogate family for us. We had people there that I would call friends now, that at that point felt more like a parent relationship almost. They were able to advise us and help us understand what was happening with my new child and what are we supposed to do with this thing. Because you don't know. When you take that baby home from the hospital, you don't know what's going on.
Right.
And the church was able to come around us and really help us through that and learn and grow. And we were good for the church as well. It's definitely a symbiotic thing. They benefited us tremendously, and I think that we were a benefit there as well. Even though if you'd have said, okay, Mike, I was 23, 24, where are you going to live? Where are you going to start in ministry? Where are you going to be? That place was not even on my radar. That would not have been that wouldn't have been what I selected. But God was able to direct us and the church together and bring us into relationship. And we still have great friends there. We still have people that we're in contact with and relationship with. Emily did a internship there this summer, and it was fun for them to see her in a whole new way, I think, as a young adult. And in a lot of ways, she is close to the point that we were at when we first came to town. So.
Yeah, I think kind of what you said, how your student ministry, how being in student ministry as a child, as a student, kind of shaped the way you do ministry.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I spent lots of time in the student ministry world, and that is like, and even that has shaped my understanding of the kind of community environment that we're trying to have here at WestWay Christian Church, of just doing things that seemingly seem are random. Like we've done things like we've done Taco Sunday and ice cream.
That's what I was just came to mind.
I mean, we've done all of those kind of things, and as I've thought about those things, like that was the kind of stuff that I pulled off in student ministry, like, and that was for a big transition in just in my own thinking and my own understanding about ministry and my role in ministry. Was I saw, like when I was on the student ministry side, I saw all of these things like kind of working on the student ministry side. Oh, so how do you build community? How do you get people in relationship with one another? You do things like have ice cream together, and just in my mind, I was like, well, why as a church, like, why is it that when kids graduate from high school, or maybe it's not when they maybe it's when they graduate from college, like, what is it that changes in a church and in a ministry environment that says, like, that stuff just doesn't work anymore?
We don't need to do that stuff anymore.
Yeah, I mean, and I couldn't, and I don't know that there was one, like, I don't think I woke up one day like wondering that, but just over a period of time, like and I think some of it was probably I was observing the way my students interacted with one another, and I would observe the way adults typically interacted with one another, and in a lot of ways they could not have been more different, and I couldn't like figure that out. So one of the reasons that we do many of these sort of relational things together is because it worked in my student ministry, And I think we've seen here, here at Westway Christian Church, I think we've seen that same kind of relational development happen in those exact same kinds of situations that we place our adults in
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, I think, do you know who Mike Bro is?
Yeah.
Mike Bro's a pastor at a church out in Kentucky. And I heard him speak one time, and he was talking about his interview process with this church, Southland. He said, he was a youth pastor, and he'd been a youth pastor for several years and did youth ministry very well. And in the interview process, he told them, you need to know that if you hire me, I'm going to do youth ministry with big people, is what he said. And I just remember that phrase, and I always like that, because I think there's so many things in kind of the youth ministry world that are really focused on developing relationships.
Yeah.
And you're right, somewhere along the line, we stop thinking about developing relationships, and we kind of think, well, this is what my circle of friends or whatever, that's who I have, that's who it's going to be. And we stop developing those relationships, and we stop developing new relationships.
Right.
And I think that's really to our detriment and the detriment of the church as a whole, as well as those people who don't have good relationships that need them and could find them in a church that is willing to focus on developing those.
Yeah.
I think of, like, we've got the trunk or treat coming up at the end of this month. That's a great opportunity for people to develop relationships. I mean, obviously, when some kid comes to your trunk and you just dump a handful of candy in their bag and they move off to the next one, we're not asking anybody to develop a best friend in that moment.
Right.
But it could be that the people in your small group that you work with for several hours together, setting up and planning your trunk or your whatever activity you want to do at the trunk or treat, those might be the relationships that are developing most. And those community interaction times, those are really some opportunities for us just to make a first contact. We'll have people here in the parking lot that don't really know anything about us other than here's this thing that we've done, and my kids can go there and have fun and get some candy and play some games. Maybe I'll have a hot dog. And so those first contact things really are a great place for relationship to start. But then we also want to be moving deeper into relationships.
Right.
I can't wait for it. Excites me to think about having somebody working with a team to set up some activity for trunk or treat whose first contact with WestWay was at trunk or treat years and years ago. I haven't necessarily seen that yet, but if we do things right as a church, if we function well, that's the progression that we can see people follow. Some kind of surface level interaction where they see something that's missing in their own lives, and then they're relationally drawn into the rest of what's going on here at WestWay. And the rest of what's going on here at WestWay is that Jesus is on the move, and he is drawing people near to him, and he's deploying them into ministry situations of their own. And sometimes that's as simple as setting up a trunk or treat to give away candy to some kid from town.
Yeah. And I mean, we've certainly seen, maybe not from the trunk or treat side, but we've certainly seen people who are new and newer to Westway Christian Church, who have simply engaged in the wacky things we do, like having tacos and ice cream and cookies during Christmas. Like, they've just been a part of that. Like, they've just engaged in those things that are very relational by design and by nature, and I think for a lot of those people, the next thing they've known is, oh, I'm actually talking to someone. I'm actually having meaningful conversations with people that I hadn't anticipated that I was going to have, all because we served tacos back in May. And so, I mean, for me, just thinking through, I wish I would have thought of that micro line, because that's really good. But I would say that many of the things that we've done, that I've kind of worked us through as a church are, we are doing a lot of student ministry stuff.
Yeah.
Just on a much different and a much bigger scale. And I'm like, in the back of my mind, I for a lot of years I asked that question. I wonder if that will work. I think that might work. And I mean, it kind of does. And I think one of the reasons why that sort of relational piece works on the student ministry side is something that I experienced in student ministry was every single year, regardless of how many kids stayed in my youth group from one year to the next. I mean, obviously there was always graduations, and there were always newer kids coming into our ministry. We had a different youth group every single year.
Yeah.
Even if 90% of the kids from spring, the fall were the exact same kids. Our youth group was always changing. It was always different. Whatever worked at the end of the year last year didn't work in fall. Like, so we were trying to figure that out. And I think maybe one of the things that's changed from the church environment, and maybe why some of these things are working now, is because our culture is probably a little more transient than it was 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So I think part of this is adopting some of the things that have worked in student ministry in terms of how do we bring people together so that we can catalyze some of those early relationships on. And I think most of the things we've done have been around food, which most people like. So relationships are important. We really went down a path, but relationships are important. And Christ has not just reconciled us with God, but he's reconciled us with one another. And I think of how many relationships I have with other Christians that if it weren't for Jesus, I just wouldn't be in a relationship with them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things you talked about a couple of weeks ago was that just in how we're made for relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this idea of Christ reconciling, not just with God, but with each
Mm-hmm.
other. We see that over and over in Scripture, where our relationship with our fellow man has been broken by sin as much as our relationship with God has. And God wants to restore that.
Mm-hmm.
Christ came to reconcile those relationships. Even to the point where he said, if you're coming to the temple to make a sacrifice and you're at the altar and you remember your brother has something against you, you go make that right before you make your sacrifice. I don't want your sacrifice if your relationships aren't right. And I think if we could hear the tone in Jesus' voice, I think that was a much sharper comment than we tend to make it.
Mm-hmm.
We hear it as a good suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was a little more than that. And even the broader scope of Scripture, we see at Babylon, God divides the people by language. And there's a break in people's relationship, in groups of people's relationships with other groups of people. And then at Pentecost, we see the reversal of that. Right. They all heard the message in their own languages. And I think the church is a picture of that reconciliation that the world needs to hear, because the world is full of broken relationships, and it's full of people in broken relationships that are seeking whole relationships. And really, there's no there's no better place to find that than in the church. When the church is at its best, when the church is fully functioning and fully engaged in the mission of Jesus to reconcile all things, that's where people will find wholeness in their relationships.
And once we're in right relationship with other people, then we can work together and actually do, at the end of that first section in Ephesians chapter 2, Paul writes that God has created things in advance for us to do, good works for us to do. And one of those good works is being in right relationship with one another. And other of those good works are just being involved and engaged in the lives of others. And whether that's on a personal level or whether that's on a community level, which we talked a little earlier at the very beginning, like what our staff was doing. Something we've done the last 3 years is participate in United Way's Day of Caring and pack food. All that food stays here. It's similar to what we did back in March. And I think one of the things that for people who are involved and engaged in life at WestWay, I think they've seen over the last couple of years a greater level of involvement and commitment to being engaged in our community. And that's because A, it's a way to serve God, but B, it's an opportunity for us to engage with people in our community. And when you were talking earlier, just even about the trunk or treat thing, I think it's a way for people, if we do it right, I think it's a way for people in our community to see that Christians are just normal people. Like, can we, and I'm sure I'll talk about this the closer we get to trunk or treat, but can we just, as Christians, can we just be normal? Like, can we, I mean, just like everyone else, I hate going to Walmart. And that's a normal, I mean, that's a normal thing. And I think Christians have a really bad reputation. Some Christians, not all Christians. But I think some Christians have a really bad reputation. And I think it's beneficial for our community just to see us doing normal things. And even today, after this food pack, there was another group of people that were at our table with us, and we went to Sandy's for breakfast as a group, and we just invited them along and can we just be normal people? Can we just engage people? And we didn't. It wasn't something where we were trying to evangelize them and get them to come to WestWay Christian Church or anything like that.
And they weren't trying to sell us their bank
They
stuff.
They weren't. It was just like we just had a meal together and talked about normal things. Yeah. And a lot of the things that we're doing, that we're in trying to partner with the community right now, is like, we just want to be normal. We want people to come to the trunk or treat and see that we are people just like they are.
Well, I think it's a good opportunity for people in the community who don't know a lot about the church, or specifically about our church. It's kind of that safe space for them to kick the tires a little bit, just to find out. Because for people that are not familiar with the church, it's really easy for them to be leery of feeling out of place. Like, I don't know what I'm going to be asked to do. I don't know when I'm supposed to sit and when I'm supposed to stand and when I'm supposed to do this or where I'm supposed to go. And so it's easier just to stay away. Right. I remember when Josiah was younger, we went to a scout thing, and it was his first thing with scouting. And we went in, and we had no idea what we were supposed to be doing. He had on his little uniform because we knew that was part of it, and that, like, we didn't know anything. And I remember feeling so awkward and out of place, and thinking, this is what people feel like when they come to church. This is what people feel like when they show up for the first time. And so with things like trunk or treat, it's a chance for them to get close and see what things look like, kind of scope out the territory a little bit maybe, and just see that, okay, maybe it's not going to be like I've made that first contact. Now we can check it out a little bit more. And that's really the kind of environment that we want to create. And that's also the kind of environment we want to create on Sunday when people come, they don't feel like there's a lot of unexplained things. They know what's happening, and we explain why. Sometimes for those of us that are here every week, it's really easy for us just to, we know what's going to happen, and so we assume what's next, and we're usually right. And it's easy for us to kind of check into autopilot mode a little bit. But for those that are new, it's all new.
Yeah.
There's an uncertainty that is really uncomfortable for people, and so we want to do what we can to make sure and minimize that. I talked to one lady a couple weeks ago who she had noticed someone here for the first time, and this lady was sitting by herself, and so she went over and just introduced herself. That's what we need to do.
Yep.
And I'll be the first one to say I'm not good at that. Like, I'm just not a first time here I am kind of person. So those of you that are, thank you for doing what you do. But all of us, I think, have a role in making people feel welcome.
Right.
Like they could belong here.
And a big way we do that is by the way we relate with one another. You know, when someone comes in here, they want to see people who actually seem like they want to be here, and who actually seem like they enjoy one another's company. Which is why, again, that's why we try to do some things that are just more fun in nature. It's just an opportunity for us to be together and to laugh, because people want to be a part of something that's fun. So kind of as an encouragement for this, really we would encourage you to think about the ways that you relate to other people here at WestWay Christian Church. Doesn't mean everybody has to be best friends, and I don't think Jesus would expect that. It does mean that as a unified body, we want to be focused on the things that Jesus is focused on, and one of those things is just loving people well who are not a part of the kingdom, who aren't insiders yet. And I think we can do that by trying to help people feel like they're insiders, even on their first time.
Yeah. It's one of the things that always amazes me about the disciples and the way Jesus brought them together. Like, there were people out of the 12 disciples, there were a couple pockets that were on exactly opposing teams in several different ways.
Yeah.
And yet Jesus brought them together and said, okay, now this is what you're going to be about. And they were able to put aside their own preferences, their own prior ways, really, and make their lives about his mission instead of their own, and be on the same team. I think as the church, we have a lot of people with a lot of different opinions and a lot of different preferences, and that's the way it should be.
Yeah.
And yet we can still see each other as being on the same team. We're on the same side. It's not my side, and it's not your side. It's Jesus. And he's the one that brings us together, obviously. But that just always amazes me. And I mean, we don't have people that necessarily are in fighting factions. But Jesus did. And if they can break down those walls, I don't think there's anything that I know of in our community that he can't work us through.
Right. Well, this week, on Sunday, we're going to start reading through chapter 3, the first section of chapter 3. I think you said this yesterday in the elders meeting. It's Paul's longest parenthetical notation. So Paul starts saying something. And
by the way.
Yeah, and by the way. and then he picks it up at the end of chapter 3.
Like 14 verses later.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about we're just going to talk about that very next section in Ephesians chapter 3 about what did Paul find his identity in, and how did that identity really drive everything that he was, how he lived his life, how he interacted with other people. So that's Sunday's text. Thanks for watching. We'd love for you to like this, share this, pass this on, invite people into relationship at WestWay. We do have a couple things starting on Sunday. We have the, I want to say visionary marriage, and I know that's not right.
Sacred marriage.
Thank you, sacred marriage. We have sacred marriage Sunday school class from 9 to 10. Ace and Sue Backer are leading that, and then Mike and Marcia Maring, someone else from here at Westway, they're going to be leading a finance class essentially. How do I think about money? And then we have our Next Steps event following that. If you haven't signed up for Next Steps, there's still time to do that, but we want you to do that today or tomorrow. And all three of these things, I said this on Sunday, so I'll say it again. These are not just ways for us to tell you what to do in your life. These are ways to engage other people in relationship.
Yeah.
So I think if we can maybe mentally get past the I'm going to this class and move to no, this is a way for me to develop relationships with other people. I think we would be further on the path of building good relationships within our church.
Yeah.
So
even when we talk about money.
So thanks for watching today, and we will see you
Sometime
sometime soon. So see ya.
Bye.